Welcome to Hiraeth, the home of modern Welsh politics. What a week for Welsh politics. After many months of will they, won't they's, we finally have a deal. A cooperation agreement between Plaid Cymru and Welsh Labour on 46 policy areas. But what does it mean for Wales? Joining me to talk through his recent interview with Cymru's comeback kid, Adam Price, we are joined by the National's chief political commentator, Theo Davies-Lewis. Hi, Theo.
Hi, Matt.
So you've recently conducted a couple of big interviews with some high-profile Plaid Cymru figures. But before we get on to your interview with Adam, can we talk a little bit about your interview with Ian Wyn-Jones?
Yeah, I mean, it was an interesting one. And obviously, Ian's had his autobiography come out, which was a really interesting read. And he's done it, and obviously, when these things happen, whether it's a book or it's a political event, whether they're on the front line or not, politicians do quite a lot of interviews. And I hope to think that my interviews are relatively probing and interesting and a bit different. And I thought, going into that interview with Ian, obviously wanted to talk about the One Wales government and that sort of thing. But I think it is quite well rehearsed, to be honest with you, because everyone will ask the same sort of questions. What is most interesting, and of course, headline grabbing is what he thinks about the party now and how it's operated over the last 6 to 12 months. And I think what a lot of people caught on to in that interview was that the strategy during the election of Plaid Cymru, specifically the independence question, was a mistake, which obviously is addressed in this interview with Adam that I did this week. But I think it just does show you that actually on the big fundamental question, I think I'll probably come on to it. I think it's the big fundamental question, as always for Plaid Cymru, there are disagreements about the strategy, and I don't think that will ever end really for the party.
But did you directly tell Adam about this interview with Ian?
Yes, I did. I said, do you, agree with... I think he actually had read it. If he was properly briefed, I think he would have read it. But, I did say, did he agree with his comments that the pledging a referendum in the first term of a Plaid Cymru government was a mistake? And Adam said he didn't agree, of course. He respectfully disagreed, I think, was the phrase that he used. And I think what was interesting about that exchange that we had in a very cold Llandaff Fields with very bright trainers, which I'm very grateful that Kerry is actually not on the podcast to make fun of me for those trainers. But what was interesting about that exchange was that he was very adamant, Adam Price, that it wasn't a mistake. When we're speaking now, Matt, we're still waiting for a lot of the findings from David Tristan, former party chair, to come out in terms of what happened in that election, what were the mistakes and so on. But Adam Price is very adamant that that wasn't the major element that damaged the party electorally, which meant they didn't advance, significantly beyond their usual heartlands. And for him, he was saying, and I think this is obviously an insight into Adam's own political ideology, that he joined Plaid Cymru because he believes in self-government for Wales. And obviously over time for Plaid Cymru, that's meant different things, even from comparing Saunders-Lewis and Gwynfor Evans or David Wigley, David L. It's always very, very different. And for Adam Price, of course, that's very definitive now. And I think for most of the party, it's quite definitive. But how they get there, I think that's obviously the big question for them.
You mentioned the Tristan review. Beyond the vague idea that it's coming, do we have any more details of when we can expect to see that?
Well, I certainly haven't had any details. He did. So Adam did reference this, and he has referenced it in a few interviews that he's done. But for as far as I understand it, I was expecting it back in September. To be honest with you, so I haven't seen anything with it. I know people that have contributed to that report, and in this interview with Adam, he touches upon how there are issues identified in terms of the electoral machine within Plaid Cymru, bigger strategic questions. But, I think there's obviously going to be that discussion over the party conference this weekend, and obviously superbly timed to have two nationalist party conferences in Scotland and in Wales. And just before I came on, Matt, was reading some commentary around the SNP conference. Obviously, they're at a different stage in terms of the journey to independence than Plaid Cymru and Wales is. But even there's still that looming question: how do they get to a referendum? And of course, as we'll probably talk about, Wales won't go before Scotland in terms of that. So there's still a lot of matters which I think whenever you interview lots of Welsh nationalists, you always feel slightly there's something missing. And I think in terms of the scrutiny of the party and the election, I mean, Adam Price, so you get an impression, your listeners get an impression, really didn't want to talk about the election when he kept sort of joking, I'm trying to move you forward to talk about the future, Theo. And I said, well, we've got to talk about the past first. And yeah, it's clear that it is that review, will show a lot of failings, things to be optimistic about. But again, it shows electorally over the last 20 years, Plaid Cymru really haven't advanced. As Ieuan Wyn-Jones touched upon as well, the party machinery has really, really not advanced significantly enough to make grounds that they would have liked to have done.
Do you think it's a case that Adam hasn't really fully appraised the result of the election and his role in the rather disappointing result? Or do you think it's a case that he has appraised it, realised it was a lot to do with him, and as a consequence doesn't want to talk about it?
That's a really, really good question, actually. And I think the impression I had from speaking to him was that he was very uncomfortable talking about the election and didn't want to. And he said he didn't want to talk about it. And I think the positioning of it from his team and the strategist as a presidential election was obviously a mistake. He's intelligent enough to realise that. I personally think it was wrong for him to pledge that referendum specifically, but he did throw it back to me and said, well, if I hadn't done that, you would have all said, why didn't you play your trump card and put the referendum up there? So we can disagree with, on those points. I think Adam definitely, just because of the man he is and the politician he is, he's very, very, very intelligent, probably one of the most intelligent in Welsh politics over the last few years, would realise his role in that. But again, I think this is interesting, just where Ieuan and Adam would have agreed. Ieuan was quite firm as well, that you can't just blame the leader. And obviously lots of those election results we saw were down to wider problems within the party machinery. And Ieuan was talking about how, he had tried to set up a national campaigning framework in 1999 for Plaid Cymru, and that hadn't gone anywhere. But you are right that, you have to ask the question about how Adam Price specifically was positioned during this election. And we've talked a lot about on these podcasts about, what's gone wrong, what's gone right for nationalists in Wales. I think your question has made me think that we really haven't discussed it too much about, what actually happened. And Plaid Cymru now, very conveniently, of course, with this cooperation agreement, with this remarkable comeback, have kind of are hoping, I think, to sweep it under the rug quite slightly, because all you've seen on social media this week, definitely from the Plaid Cymru accounts, not so much from the Welsh Labour accounts, is that how amazing progressive cooperative politics is, and not much talk about, well, are we going to talk about how you guys get into government in 5 years' time? And that I think that tension will probably come out during the party conference season. But if you're a member of Plaid Cymru, do you want to talk about how you essentially overpromised and underdelivered in May, or do you want to talk about how most of your policies in the manifesto, the big ones, are now in a Welsh Government programme agenda? I know what option I would pick.
We'll get onto that straight after this question. But it's very interesting what you said then about it not all being the leader's fault. Things like party machinery, making sure that there are campaign teams and campaign strategies in place. Does the buck on that not fall with the leader? Is it a case that, although it may not be his fault, it's certainly his responsibility?
Oh yeah, don't get me wrong. I think Adam Price, I think he would have taken stock for the responsibility that he has, and would take some of the blame. I think the big problem for Plaid Cymru was the lack of talent. Actually, I think there wasn't a natural challenger to Adam Price after the election. It was his first electoral test. Yes, there were unique circumstances. The power of the incumbency of Mark Drakeford, I think, as Adam actually said in the interview, meant that it was impossible to, actually overturn that. But then, of course, it does look a bit silly that he kept saying he was going to be First Minister. But then again, of course, if he hadn't said that, it would all be very strange. So there's so many tensions, so many contradictions. But you are right, Matt, that I think, over the last 3 or 4 years, the hype, as I've written about, of course, and I was wondering what Adam's going to say to me about some of the columns I've written about his leadership of the party. I thought I was going to get in trouble. The hype really hasn't, he hasn't really lived up to expectations and the hype so far, and I was doing some reading before I went to see him of when he first became party leader and, the subsequent tensions he had, of course, with his former friend, Leanne Wood. Not much has changed really for Plaid Cymru aside from that. I think obviously they've changed slightly on the independence question, because now that has come into the mainstream of politics. But in terms of the development of their campaigning framework and, how they've built their political bases across Wales, that hasn't significantly changed as the election showed. So what I do hope actually happens, when, this poll will go out and things maybe be said, ahead of time, I do hope that the conference for the Welsh nationalists is a time for them to reflect on, what has happened. But again, as we'll talk about, it does depend it does depend really what they want to be as a party as well, because if they don't necessarily want to be office seekers, they want to be, policy seekers and vote seekers instead, whatever the decision they take is, which I touched on with Adam, that will frame how they organise themselves. So I think, again, yes, there's lots of excitement this week, but there is still, I think, looming questions for the purpose of Plaid Cymru beyond the basic, this is what we stand for kind of thing. What do they want to do and achieve? One line strikes me from Ieuan Wyn-Jones's interview, which I think is quite powerful, that he really didn't agree with being a party that persuades other people to do things for Wales. And this agreement is a brilliant case in point in that. They've decided to follow the same route as they've taken over the last 20 years. But again, it's probably because they want to be a policy-seeking party rather than a party of government.
Talking about getting other parties to do stuff for you, do you think this cooperation deal and the amount of Plaid policies which now form the basis for a programme of government have somewhat diminished the disappointment of that election result?
Possibly. And I think, again, it's a really good question. I think we'll see over the next few days. Obviously, we're recording this before the members have voted on it. I don't think there will be a massive surprise there. I think it will probably be voted through, but that's the commentator's curse for you, that things get turned upside down over the next few days. I think to some extent it does. But again, there's that existential question for them. If they're happy to lose elections, but then get their policies through, fine, so be it, but just be honest about it every 5 years rather than come into every election saying we're going to win. I think, listen, obviously I don't think this agreement necessarily will do huge electoral damage to Plaid Cymru in 5 years. I don't see, seats going from Plaid to Tory or Plaid to Labour as a result of this significantly, like a kind of coalition, like you saw with the Lib Dems in 2015 and so on. What it does, of course, is blurs the lines between Welsh Labour and Plaid Cymru, and when does one end and when does the other one begin? And for lots of members, this is exactly what they want. They've got, things like Unni Cymru, discussions about devolving broadcasting, free school meals, which was totally, not on the Welsh Labour agenda even a few months ago. I mean, it is quite a remarkable, radical agenda. But again, it is, as Adam says to me in the interview, they're a policy-seeking party, and more important than, beyond gaining office, more important for them is independence for Wales. Or that more important I can't speak for all party members, of course, and Adam wouldn't be able to either, I don't think. But for Adam Price, the most important thing is independence rather than being in Welsh Government. And that means, of course, having this sort of agreement, which I do accept, is a rare kind of policy-focused stepping stone to more distinctive Welsh politics, which I think is different personally to other compact agreements or budget deals that we've seen before, because of how extensive it is and the timing of it and what's actually in there, because of so many of the big policies are Plaid Cymru driven policies, which I think is remarkable. So for some extent, just to your original question, Matt, I think it will, for some members, in a good way, or sort of overshadow the election result. And, at the end of the day, it gives Plaid Cymru some sort of direction for the next 3 years, but certainly not in a kind of electoral way, because there are still, of course, questions as to, if you're a politician, you want to get re-elected in 2026. And I'm yet to be informed of what the strategy will be and what things will look like. But, it could be just more of the same, judging by the history of Plaid Cymru throughout devolution.
You've talked a little bit about it. I'd be interested to know what your assessment is of the deal, because to me, it's being such a significant document that covers such a broad range of areas. There is a danger, of course, that it turns into a wish list, but not something that can be delivered upon in its entirety. Do you think that if this document is not significantly delivered upon by the end of the 3-year agreement term, that it will reflect very, very poorly on Adam and Plaid Cymru as a whole?
That's another interesting question, because the delivery element is really, the onus is on Welsh Labour because they're really in government. And I know there'll be elements of sort of Plaid Cymru appointed special advisors, I think, to work on the deal, no ministers, etc., etc. So that's fine. But really, there's an element of gambling in the sense that Adam is kind of depending on Welsh Labour to follow through as well. Of course, he's got to help them vote it through the Senedd. But there is that danger that it isn't delivered. And, this was, I think I referred to in the interview as a kind of rose garden moment. Cameron Clegg of Wales was a bit, Drakeford and Price would probably, probably gag at the thought being referred to those two. But, them on the steps of the Senedd with this agreement, the sheer amount of coverage and analysis, how Plaid Cymru has positioned it as a kind of progressive means of operating in Wales, which is totally different, of course, to politics in England, not so much to Scotland, of course. But there is the danger that this agreement's been signed, not enough scrutiny is given by Plaid Cymru to Welsh Labour. I think the phrase that is now being used, and I think he used it at the BBC today, Adam did, was co-opposition or something, which I obviously don't understand. But, it's a really hard tension. A coalition, I asked Adam this, a coalition was never on the cards, and because he would never have gone into one in a position of weakness. But again, this is what I try and remind my readers in the interview and sort of discuss with Adam, and we discussed this a bit in the interview, is that obviously there are two parties. It's not just about Plaid Cymru. Obviously, this Plaid Cymru conference is all very exciting, but you've got Welsh Labour there. And, for them, of course, there is an onus for them on to deliver. So yes, it might reflect badly on Adam, but remember, 3 years is a very key number, because in 3 years' time, Mark Drakeford will not be the First Minister of Wales. And he is not going to want to finish his career in politics with 12, 15, 20 of these 46 policy areas covered. He will want that. He would want all of them delivered. And, time will tell to see whether they will be.
I was going to ask you what you made of the sort of internal governance structures of the deal. We know Plaid have been a little bit concerned about governments and implementation. We know that they'll have 2 special advisors in government to make sure the work proceeds. Do you think Plaid are right to be wary of Labour?
I think so. If you sign an agreement with a party government and give it, not giving them the policies, but there are lots of ideas there, like Annie Cymru and lots of these more nationalist kind of policies. They are putting them into a joint programme of government with an opposition party. You have to be wary. If you weren't, it'd be very, very concerning. And that's probably why it's taken so long as well. Obviously, this has been going on for the negotiations, as far as I understand it, for about 6 months. And they have to be wary, because otherwise you don't hold their feet to the fire. I'm quite interested, actually, more broadly in terms of what happens with this agreement if it ever would collapse, for example. I don't know what circumstance it would be, the wider politics, because obviously, Adam, there's things in there that the only thing I think the Welsh Conservatives have said right this week, out of thousands of sound bites, is probably that there's not hardly enough on the NHS in this agreement, because I think there are still fundamental differences between parties as to how you manage such a big policy area. But are there areas within this that could cause tensions if Plaid Cymru special advisors report back saying these guys aren't doing anything on this, they are kicking the can down the road? I think then that is very, very interesting as to how this managed. Don't get me wrong, I don't think this is going to be plain sailing for 3 years. Adam Price will be holding, if he was, a sensible politician, which he is, holding Mark Drakeford's feet to the fire. You cannot necessarily expect Welsh Labour to deliver everything in 3 years like that. It's going to take a lot of hard work. Politics changes. The kind of the mantra events, dear boy, events, and we've seen with the pandemic how things can shift and how quickly, and it will be something that Plaid Cymru will need to be considering over the next few years. And of course, when we're looking at Mark Drakeford's departure and all this programme, you can assume is delivered, what happens next then? Does that continue into 2026? Possibly, I don't know. But it is a danger, I think, for Plaid Cymru, and it's not necessarily a way of giving responsibility over. It'll be a continuous negotiation, I think, for the next 3 years to get this done.
We can see that Plaid and Labour are already working quite closely together. I don't know if anyone's seen FMQs this week, but it was essentially just Plaid and Labour MS talking about how good their deal was.
Legendary, it's legendary tag team, Matt. It's just fantastic.
And then Adam and Mark essentially spending their 3 questions throwing balls up to bat back at the Tories. But what effect do you think this deal will have on the levels of scrutiny and accountability within the Senate over the next 3 years or so?
Well, actually, I think that Adam is comfortable being an opposition politician and scrutinising Welsh Labour. But, on these 46 policy areas, there's probably not going to be much scrutiny across the Senate chamber, because you're going to have, you'll obviously have Plaid and Labour backbenchers and so on with different views and asking questions, which I hope would happen. But then, of course, you have to look at, who's left in the Senate. I'd say there's the true opposition parties. You've got the Welsh Conservatives, who are, I assume, going to oppose pretty much most of the things, in here if they don't agree with it. And then Jane Dodds. But we've also seen, the level of scrutiny we've had over the last week, obviously from the Tories in Wales, has just been absolutely woeful. There has been no means of critically engaging with this at all as a constructive party. It's been just tweets saying, vote Plaid, get Labour, vote Labour, get Plaid. There's no intellectual depth whatsoever. The usual sort of lines being trotted out. And that's not the way to be a constructive opposition party, I don't think. They do, of course, have, focusing on the Welsh Conservatives, they obviously have an opportunity now to be very distinctive within the Senedd. But again, I think they're in a very difficult position on the other hand, because now you've got a supermajority on a broad range of policy areas which you might not agree with. A bigger Senedd, that's, which I think is arguably the most landmark thing within the agreement, working towards that. The Welsh Conservatives have got pretty much no hope opposing something like that now. And I think that is where you see the opposition and the scrutiny collapsing. But, we do have underrepresented at the minute, of course, Senedd committees and that sort of thing, where we'll see all these bills being pushed through. But in terms of the opposition politicians outside of Plaid and Labour, I think they've got a massive hill to climb, and they've got to do so. I think they've got to oppose this deal, actually in the spirit of how the deal has been positioned, because I think it is, whatever you think of it, and not everyone's going to agree, not everyone in Labour and Plaid, I don't think, will agree with everything that's in there, but it does show that the politics in Wales is very different to England. And just shouting that this is just a nationalist stitch-up, or Mark Drakeford has got his poodle Adam Price to do everything, I really don't think that's going to win you votes or win you respect across the chamber either.
Very interesting what you say, because it's an analysis I've heard a lot, that the Conservatives are not really trying to engage in the substance of the deal. They are more concerned about who has tweeted in support of the deal. But how do you expect them to respond for the next 3 years? They're going to have to engage in the substance of it. And, if you were looking at it through a conservative ideological perspective, there's surely quite a lot to oppose.
I think obviously the First Minister's absolutely cascading speech towards the Welsh Conservative Party, the Senedd, was actually quite devastating. This week, saying that they deserve to be in the wilderness, and that's why they don't deserve to be near government and so on. Obviously, he made a slight mistake and obviously apologised afterwards about the letters he had received from the Conservative Party. But we'll let him off for that. But it is a very difficult challenge. I think at the minute, though, there is no agreed strategy. I don't think beyond kind of ad hoc bashing Labour and Plaid together as a nationalist stitch-up. It's the same thing with the Constitutional Commission, even though, as I understand it, they've had a Conservative appointee on the Commission panel. So I don't really quite understand the coherent strategy in the long term for this. Obviously Andrew RT will be returning to work in the next few weeks, which is good news. But again, I think the Welsh Conservative Party, since the election, like Plaid Cymru actually, haven't really found their feet as to, where do we go from here. Plaid Cymru now, of course, I've got a policy agenda to stick to. The Welsh Conservatives don't really, and I think, as I've argued with you before, I think they are missing the foundation of intellectual depth, of strategy in the long term. What is our purpose in Wales? Is it essentially to take orders from Downing Street and then to oppose everything we see in the Chamber? Or is there a more nuanced way, as I'm sure many of their members would do, that they can scrutinise parts of this agreement? But of course, the noise that we hear, the noise the public will hear, will just be more of the same. And once we think about, the future of the Welsh Conservative Party, I don't think that is the same kind of party as we would have seen, of course, in the first 10, 15 years of devolution. But maybe we're too far down that road now, and the party has decided essentially in its own way. We've got two pressure groups. You've got a Welsh nationalist pressure group, and you've got a British nationalist pressure group in the Senedd, and they might have decided that beyond any sort of strategy, they would much rather sit there and just hammer home, the CCHQ messaging. For me, of course, that's incredibly sad, and I don't think that's a healthy thing for our democracy. But then, of course, with a bigger Senedd, we might see a more diverse set of people coming into the party. So we'll have to see.
Me and you, Theo, have talked an awful lot in the past about how, in order to really start to take the centre ground in Wales, the Conservatives need to be quite a front foot forward pro-devolution party, as opposed to erring on the side of caution. Do you think that this deal runs the risk of energising the devo-skeptic, anti-devolution wing of the Conservative Party even more, so that you see the Conservative Party lurk towards that part of their potential ideology?
I think so, and I think probably now you probably see with the party that we're seeing more of those kinds of messages. I mean, very subtly anti-devolution messages, more kind of, it just comes across that there's, I don't want to say anti-Wales, but I think it's more kind of just a willingness, not to engage at all with where Wales is at the minute. And I think that is, of course, very, very different to the Wales that we're seeing develop. And I think there is a kind of centre-right a role in Wales. And I think actually, not everyone will agree. I think Wales, so many parts of our society is actually inherently small c conservative, actually. And I think that is untapped, particularly if you look at, Welsh Labour's record of delivery on certain policy areas. I think some opinion polls, of course, in the past have shown huge potential for Welsh Conservative gains. But I don't think, now with any sort of anti-devolution agenda and the same sort of sound bites as we heard, of course, during the election, that's not going to work. And I think I was so pleased, actually, that didn't work in the election, and particularly the performance specifically of the Abolish the Welsh Assembly Party, because I think there was, as in typical Welsh fashion, lots of melancholic schizophrenia about what could happen. And, for me, I don't think I think devolution is the right thing for Wales. I think it's been a good thing for Wales. There's certainly, like in Scotland as well, actually, areas of policy that there hasn't been enough improvement, and as was promised. But I think it is inherently a good thing for Wales, and of course the majority of the Welsh public support that view overwhelmingly. So if you want to be a party that participates in that and tries to win government, as of course Ieuan was discussing with me that the Conservatives almost did in 2007, you have to be constructive. You have to think, what is our long-term strategy beyond, as Lord Bourne, the former leader, was talking to me for the IWA's Agenda magazine, beyond talking about pubs opening across the border in England during the pandemic. That is not the way to operate in a modern, devolved Britain if you would like to enter government. So there is that danger. I don't see a flagrant anti-devolution strategy being adopted, but I think it's just more the subtle drip-drab kind of, this is a nationalist stitch-up, the same kind of criticisms. And beyond the fact that I disagree with the sentiment, I actually don't think it's going to work anyway, of course. But again, the interesting thing is the extent to which this is delivered, because it has this programme for government. It has to be delivered, of course, so people in Wales at the next election, and looking back at Mark Drakeford's tenure, think, okay, well, these guys are still in charge. But again, as we saw, in the recent election, Wales has immense confidence in the Welsh Labour Party, and that was, I think, based off the performance of the First Minister throughout the pandemic. In 2026, we can assume, we all hope as well that we won't have to do that in the context of COVID, and that'll be much more interesting to see how the people of Wales judge the Welsh Labour Party and possibly Plaid Cymru on how they've delivered policy, and therein lies possibly an opportunity for a constructive pro-devolution Welsh Conservative Party in the years to come.
Let's talk about the Welsh Labour aspect then. Have you heard anything about the response to this deal from our old friends in the Welsh PLP and more broadly in the PLP at large?
Well, I think it's really interesting. I mean, obviously we had the approval from the working groups of Plaid Cymru and Welsh Labour, I think whenever it was last weekend, the governance groups. And I think there was a quote in some of the stories where obviously there was a kind of definitive agreement in the Welsh Labour group for this. And the big question overwhelmingly, I think, always with Welsh Labour and Labour more broadly, is that there's so many different factions. I think obviously some members of the Welsh Labour Party in the House of Commons, who arguably would equate Toryism and nationalism as two evils. And actually, to be fair, Mark Drakeford has done the same in previous comments that he's made, because ideologically, I think he said actually nationalism is inherently right wing. So, I mean, when does one stop at the other end for some people? But again, I think look at the response on social media. If you aren't speaking to these politicians, all the posts are coming from, or most of the posts are coming from Welsh members of the Senedd and, Welsh constituency associations. I mean, I think there is a very distinctive difference between the British Labour Party and the Welsh Labour Party. And I actually made this quip as a kind of half joke, just so people don't think I'm losing the plot, as that Welsh Labour and Plaid Cymru should merge to Adam Price. And I think he almost fell off the bench, by the way, for like the third time during our conversation. And he said, oh, well, independence makes it quite a difficult one. But he did make that point, as he's obviously got that political nous, you'd expect, that there are many different Labour parties, which is the phrase I think he used. And he sort of referenced, the Blairites and the different factions. But you've also then got a very distinctive British Labour Party where I think would feel uncomfortable going into a deal with Plaid Cymru. But then again, I do think lots of them, obviously with respect to Mark Drakeford, I think lots of them would still, of course, see Downing Street as the prize rather than the keys to Cardiff Bay, probably because as well, they've already got the keys. They've had them for 22 years. But more than anything, I think the reaction has shown really that the Welsh Labour Party and those Welsh MPs have got different priorities. The crossover between them is not as frequent, I don't think, as some might assume. But I don't think now, again, because of the distinctiveness there and I think just the respect and power that Mark Drakeford has, there is no chance of any kind of more, a more British kind of Labour MP in Wales to intervene or say anything, because why would he or she? Because I think the majority of the Welsh Labour Party listeners of this podcast can't believe their luck that they've got this deal to basically vote through policies for the next 3 years unopposed, essentially, which is quite remarkable.
Where do you think this leaves Keir Starmer and his never-ending battle against nationalism in Scotland? Or to paraphrase Victoria Winkler, who was on the pod earlier in the week, should we simply not care?
Well, I mean, it depends which way you lean on the political spectrum, I suppose. It might have been in The Sun. I don't read The Sun very often, but it is actually very useful to see, what the British public at large are reading. And I think there was a story there about Keir being like neutral on the union or something. I think that was, maybe it was The Sun or another tabloid, which I thought was very interesting. And I think there is a very, very difficult position for Keir Starmer. And I think, again, just to go back to the Adam interview, he did mention, as we were talking with the Labour Party, he said one of the most difficult questions for Welsh Labour and Labour more broadly is how they respond to the Constitution. I mean, even if does Keir even believe in radical federalism? I mean, you could probably, I don't know how many times radical federalism has been said on this podcast. It must be in the thousands. But, it's not certain. I think this deal for Keir, again, as we've seen before, I think in other comments that he's made, very reluctant to interfere and tread on Mark Drakeford's turf. I mean, I think how many days again was the countdown when he sent a congratulatory post to Mark Drakeford after the election? I think it was like 4 days, wasn't it, or something? You must have been keeping a tally on the Hiraeth podcast, but there is a distinctiveness there. And so if you're a Welsh Labour member, I don't think you have to care. The big question, of course, is Adam Price said it was the most pressing or fundamental question in Welsh politics, which was independence. That was, not everyone will agree with that. But I think you only have to start caring if you're a Welsh Labour member, and of course, if you're Welsh anyway, is when the debate, if possibly when it does accelerate in Scotland and elsewhere, and then you do have to see a coherent strategy from Keir. And if that's at odds with Mark Drakeford or a successor, then of course you have a huge internal problem. At the minute, they've got away with it. But when push comes to shove, at that big moment, you tell me, Matt, you want to see the Labour movement united, certainly in Wales, but you don't want too many competing factions across Britain. Otherwise, you're in real danger of finding yourself in a very difficult and sticky constitutional strategy and situation.
Or warring factions is like waking up and eating breakfast in the Labour Party, Theo. I wouldn't worry, we're all used to it.
Yeah.
Thinking more holistically then about the UK and this deal, where do you think this puts Wales in relation to the other UK nations in terms of the sort of stability of government and the outlook of those governments in the next as we're getting to the end of the year, let's say, in the next 12 months or so?
Well, Wales is not like anywhere really in Britain anymore, as Adam is delighted to tell me. They were more like a Scandinavian country, like, Denmark or Norway, Sweden. It's in terms of the priorities we put on things like public services and the way we do our politics. I mean, it definitely makes us different to our friends in the East, and that was I think one of the phrases that Adam used. That I think Wales will look very, very different to England. I agree with him on that in the next 3 years if this is delivered, on free school meals and, the energy companies, broadcasting being devolved, if all these things are delivered. I think it's a remarkable, just in terms of the policy, Wales will be very different. In terms of the way we conduct ourselves, of course, there are parallels with Scotland, but I think just because of the historic tensions between Labour and Plaid Cymru, I think it is quite a landmark. Or even in the devolved era, I think there is quite a remarkable agreement. One, as I've said already, I think I do view it differently to the kind of, we know that we unlike Disraeli's famous maxim, Wales does actually love coalitions, unlike England. But I think this is different because it comes amidst future debate and conversation about where Wales is constitutionally, which is the only country, by the way, in the whole of the UK that is being constructive about the future of Britain. No other country is doing that. England is not doing it. Scotland is not doing it. And Northern Ireland is not doing it, all for very different reasons. We are, I think, whatever you stand in the political spectrum, having a conversation about our future like no other country in Britain is doing. Government will be stable here in Wales. Commentator's curse again will strike in about 6 months' time. But, we will see we know what to expect really now. Whereas, as you've seen in Westminster over the last 2 weeks, things are being U-turned all the time. Whereas this is quite firm. In some ways, of course, it's very boring now because we know what to expect, but actually it's quite exciting, I think, because there is a continuous focus on Welsh political matters, cooperation, all this fluffy stuff, which we all kind of think, this is marvelous. The chamber is a circle because we all cooperate. It's lovely. But it is also really exciting because you genuinely have a government hell-bent on nation building. And then I think the difference we now have is that we've got a government hell-bent on nation building, but backed up by quite radical left of centre policies, which not everyone, I don't agree with everything in there, but I mean, it's just quite amazing really, where we've come within the space of not even forget about the 800-year history. Just the last 18 months, I think, is just absolutely amazing.
On that very, very positive note, Theo, thank you very much for coming to talk to us. Cymru's Comeback Kid, Adam Price interview is out when?
Should be. Well, we're recording on Friday, if I'm allowed to say the exclusives, but it should be out tomorrow. But I was just going to say as well, Matt, we have to do this all again because I'm never allowed to finish on a positive note. There's always going to be something where I'm really depressed about, and I'm really worried. So it's very rare. I think I've only come on the podcast once where I've been quite happy and cheery about the future of Wales. So, I mean, maybe it's something refreshing for your listeners not to hear me complain all the time. So it's a bit different.
But if they want to hear you complain, they can find you on Twitter. Where can they find you on Twitter?
It's T Davies-Lewis, and please follow me, but do not send me any abuse about my trainers like at Kerry the Viking did, which I think is absolutely slanderous and outrageous. So you're very welcome to follow me there for political insight, but no fashion sense from the ankles down, basically.
Well, Theo, thank you again for coming on. If you have enjoyed what you've heard this evening, please do not forget to find us on Medium at Hiraeth Blog Cymru, on Facebook at Hiraeth Blog Cymru, and on Twitter at Hiraeth Blog. Thank you for listening to Hiraeth. If you like what you heard, please don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review.